So today we're going to be looking at the Eastern Woodland Indians. This is a section of your textbook in Chapter 2, Lesson 4, and it's on pages 85 to 88. So the Eastern Woodland Indians were a Native American group coming from the cultural region that spanned pretty much the entire eastern portion of the United States. As you can see, you can kind of think about it that there were Eastern Woodland Indians who lived in the southern part of the United States and also in the northern part of the United States, but it was basically the whole eastern side of the United States. We call this a cultural region, so basically anything you see now in the light green or the darker green, we would call the cultural region for the Eastern Woodland Indians. And there are lots and lots of different tribes that lived there, as you can guess, based on the amount of space that was there. It was a huge, huge area, huge map that we were looking at just a second ago. And so it was a very diverse area. There were areas in this cultural region with thick, dense, dark forests. So dark that in some portions of the forest it was hard to actually see the bottom of the floor. It was hard to get light to go through all of those treetops. There were also areas with these murky, dark swamps. And then also areas of mountains. The Appalachian Mountains runs pretty much the whole region that we're talking about here, so that was another portion of the Eastern Woodland area. So we'll really be looking at two individual tribes from this cultural region. The first is the Iroquois, and the next is the Cherokee. The Iroquois lived in the area of present-day New York. In New York State. So they pretty much the whole present-day New York State was taken up by the Iroquois Nation. The Cherokee were from the southern part of the Eastern Woodland region, and they could have been found in present-day states like West Virginia and Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, and so forth. So they weren't necessarily confined to just one state. The Iroquois are the group that we're going to talk about first. And as I said, the Iroquois were present in most of what is present-day New York State. There are 5 different tribes. They were the Seneca, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, the Oneida, and the Mohawk. Those were the 5 different tribes within the larger Iroquois tribe. So there was the Iroquois Nation, and then we have these smaller groups of smaller tribes within the Iroquois Nation. So one thing it's important to think about is that while it was a really big space of land, you think about it, New York State is a really big state. New York, and a really big piece of land that we're talking about, the area started to get really crowded, and people started to get really cranky because space just started to get more and more limited as more people lived there. So I want you to think about, a family vacation that you went on with your family. When you drive to Walmart or when you drive around town, your back seat and the area in your family's car might look pretty big. But when you're on a really long family vacation, things start to get crowded. You start to argue and probably fight with your brothers and sisters because someone might be in your space or someone might be in your way, and so forth. Also think about like a crowded elevator, how uncomfortable that is sometimes in a crowded elevator. Now the reasoning what got so crowded was because of farming. Now, as we've been talking about and as you've been learning, when civilizations started to form and become stronger, part of the reason for that was because of farming. People started to farm and make their own food. People would still go hunting and fishing, but farming took up a large portion of their time and what they did, and it also takes up a lot of space. People need room to grow crops, people need room to plant new crops, and so forth. So what started to happen with the Iroquois is that people would start to chop down some of the forests, some of the hunting grounds that different tribes would go into, and some people would start to chop down those trees and clear out those forests to make room for more farming. And so as a result, the different tribes weren't able to necessarily hunt in the same areas they did before, and they would go into new lands. They would go into other tribes' lands. And as a result, people got kind of angry about that. They started fighting with one another over people trespassing on their property and trespassing on their land. And people would argue and fight, and they would go and, let's say that one group went into someone else's land, well, the other group might retaliate and kind of attack their village, and people were being killed, and people were being injured, and people were being hurt as a result of this. A lot of people were being kidnapped and taken as prisoner. And this would just happen over and over and over again. And a lot of times people started fighting for revenge as well. So they would fight because they were angry with someone else for kidnapping a relative or kidnapping someone in their tribe or killing or injuring someone in their tribe. And as a result, they would go back and retaliate and fight for revenge. And it just became this sort of never-ending circle that people were fighting back and forth over this land and these hunting grounds as a result of people cutting down these trees to make more room for farming. So this was just sort of a never-ending cycle where people would fight because someone went into their lands, another group would retaliate, and it would just go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth for a very long period of time. Eventually, an Onondaga chief named Hiawatha kind of said, we need to stop doing this. This is kind of silly. We need to try to have peace. And he really wanted to focus on all the 5 different tribes within the larger Iroquois tribe coming together and being peaceful with one another and really working together for peace. And so a lot of other people kind of agreed with him, and he said, we need to kind of stop this never-ending circle of violence. So he called together the folks from these other tribes within the Iroquois, the Seneca, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, the Oneida, the Mohawk. They all came together to form what's known as a confederation or a federation. So they all worked together, they came together, and formed this loose group of governments that were kind of loosely connected. And if you think about it, it's almost like having a student council where you have lots of different classes, and you might have a representative or two from each class come together to try to make decisions for the school. It's kind of the same idea. The Iroquois would have 1 or 2 people from each one of their tribes who came together at this confederation. They'd work together to solve problems. So instead of fighting with one another or arguing or retaliating and causing wars, they would try to work together to solve the problems that were present and to solve the problems that were facing them, and try to broker peace and settle things in a peaceful way. So all of these different tribes came together to do that, and they would come together to vote on these compromises. So if there was an issue, they'd come together, they'd talk about it, they'd resolve the conflict, and they would all discuss it and try to find the best solution for everyone involved. So that was what was going on with this Iroquois League, the confederation of all these different tribes coming together, all these different Iroquois tribes. Now, some people refer to it almost like a longhouse, that all of these different tribes were working together as one family. Just like in a longhouse, lots of different kind of sections of one family or multiple families might come together to live in a longhouse. All of these different tribes within the Iroquois would come together to work together in this confederation. A longhouse was actually the kind of home that the Iroquois lived in. It was exactly how it looked, a long house with one main door, maybe a few different chimneys, and people of different families would each live in this longhouse together. So that was the Iroquois. The Cherokee were from the same cultural region. The Cherokee were, again, from the southern part of the present-day United States. Now, the Cherokee lived in 2 different houses. They lived in a pit house that kind of looked like this during the winter. It was kind of dug into the ground a little bit, and it was covered with mud and so forth. And it kept them warm in the winter. It was covered with kind of earthen things like mud and dirt and clay, stuff like that. But it would keep them warm in the winter when they needed to be warm. And they also had another house for the summer, And this house was a larger kind of house above the ground made of grass and clay, and maybe a bark roof, and it would allow air to kind of flow through. It would be a little bit cooler for when they were living during the summer. Now remember, southern parts of the United States would be pretty hot in the middle of the summer, so that was the reason why they needed two houses in this part of the Eastern Woodland area. So the Cherokee, again, they were from that same cultural region, the Eastern Woodland area. Now this is a picture of a Cherokee village. Now you'll notice that around the village itself they have these really tall, high wooden posts. So they built these big fences all around their villages to keep out trespassers and keep out people who didn't belong there. These wooden posts would serve as protection and would help keep the village safe in an event of an attack. This is another picture of another Cherokee village. Same idea, you have that fence line all around. But what we can see pretty clearly in this picture of this model is in the center of the village there's almost like a town square, and you see that the one building in the middle of the town, it's built sort of on a mound, and that was actually the religious temple for the community. In the center of each village was an open square with a temple that was built on top of a mound, and in that temple lived the shaman. The shaman was sort of a medicine man, and he was also sort of a political figure at the same time. He would try to heal people. He would also kind of perform different religious ceremonies and events. One event that happened every year was the green corn ceremony, which kind of celebrated a good harvest whenever there was a good harvest. So the shaman played an important role within the community, and he would hold these different ceremonies during the year in this temple in the middle of the city, in the middle of the village. Now the leader of the Cherokee, each village had its own chief. The chief would be chosen because he was a strong fighter and a strong warrior. They were a warrior people, so that was really important to them. Also, the chief would lead the village kind of in their day-to-day activities. Eventually, the Cherokee also formed a confederation where they came together to work together. Many different villages would be part of that Cherokee Federation where they worked together and kind of made decisions together. One other thing the chief would be in charge of was this game called Little War. Now, Little War, the different members of the tribe would kind of battle one another to get from one side of a field to the other side of the field, usually trying to get a ball or something else across the field or capture the other team's piece of, like, the other team's flag or ball or something else on the other side of the field. And it was a really violent game. It was a way that the Native American children were able to practice for war, because again, that was something that was pretty important to them because they were a warrior people. So preparing for war and getting ready for battle was an important part of their life. So the chief was also in charge of Little War, which was a game that they played for fun, but it was also a game that they played to prepare for war. So this, if you think of modern-day lacrosse, Little War is very similar to modern-day lacrosse, and actually the roots of modern-day lacrosse come from this idea of Little War. So it comes from something that was native to America so long ago. So if you haven't done so already, make sure that you answer the Blue Review questions on page 87 and 88 in your Social Studies textbook. These will be a good way for you to practice and review for any Social Studies quiz or test that you might have coming up. Also, make sure that you answer questions number 1, 2, and 4 on page 88. These are, again, check understanding questions that are a good way for you to prepare and study for a Social Studies quiz or a Social Studies test. If you have any questions, make sure you ask your teacher.